Her hand was still bleeding when the king knelt in front of her. Not a graze. A line across the palm, deep enough that she'd folded her fingers over it without thinking, the way you'd close a door on a draft. 3 feet away, a sword that wasn't hers lay flat in the dirt where she'd put it down. The blood had already found the cracks between the cobblestones and gone looking for more. Dane Vasara, Alpha King, blood-right ruler of 4 packs and the only man in 200 years to make the old wolf lords kneel without unsheathing a claw, was on one knee in the mud of a village square that didn't have a name worth remembering, holding her wrist like it was the only thing made of glass in the room. He hadn't knelt for his own coronation. 6 days earlier, none of this existed. There was only a girl with flour under her nails and a king who hadn't yet learned her name. The horses came first. That's how it always was. The horses before the men. Hooves on the frost-hard road, a full minute before anyone saw a banner. Soerse heard them from inside the bakehouse, felt them in the flour sacks stacked against the wall, a tremor that ran up through her bare feet before it reached her ears. She set down the dough she was working and didn't stop kneading. Hands like that don't stop for kings. They stop for burnt bread. Riverbend had 11 days left on its tribute, and a granary that had been empty since the second frost. She knew the second part because she was the one who'd counted what was left. 41 households, 6 sacks of grain. A debt to the crown calculated in another man's hand, on another man's ledger, by a headman who hadn't missed a meal since autumn. His name was Corleth Bray. He had a ring on every finger of his left hand, and none on his right. Said the right hand should stay light for counting coin. He counted Riverbend's coin like it was prayer. The horn sounded twice before the gates opened, and twice was always the king's own signal, never a herald's. Sarse wiped her hands on her apron, the linen gone the color of old rust, and stepped into the square along with everyone else, who had legs enough to stand and nothing left to lose by it. Dane Vasara did not look like a man who collected tribute from villages with empty granaries. He looked like weather. Black coat, no crown. Kings who wear crowns to collect debts are kings who expect to be doubted, and a way of sitting his horse like the horse was incidental. His eyes found the square before his men had finished dismounting. Pale gray, the color of a sky before snow, and they moved over the crowd the way a man checks a room for exits. One scar, thin and old, ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline. Nobody in Riverbend knew where he'd gotten it. Nobody was foolish enough to ask. Headman Bray. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The square had already gone silent in the particular way a room goes silent when something dangerous walks in wearing good manners. 11 days, by my count. Corleth Bray came forward with his hands already spread, already smiling, the smile of a man who has spent a lifetime being believed. My king, we've had a hard winter. Every village has had a hard winter. That is what winter is for. Dane swung down from the horse without using the stirrup, landed soft for a man his size, and that was the first thing Soerse noticed that didn't fit the stories. The stories said the Alpha King moved like a blade. Nobody mentioned he moved like something that had learned, somewhere, to be careful with its own weight. We have grain enough for half, Corleth said. I beg the king's patience for the rest. A lie. Soerse felt it land in her chest like a coin dropped from a height. She'd helped count the granary herself, 2 nights past, by the light of a single tallow candle, and there had been grain enough for less than a third, with not 1 sack to spare for begging anyone's patience. She looked at Bray's hands, steady. She looked at his rings, all 7, polished. A man who'd given up half his village's grain wouldn't still be wearing 7 rings. She didn't decide to step forward. Her feet simply stopped being willing to stay where they were. That's not true. 3 words, flat, and they landed in the square like a dropped plate. Every head turned. Bray's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did, a small, ugly flinch, gone fast. Dane Vasara turned slower than the rest, unhurried, the way a man turns when he already suspects the next 5 minutes are going to be more interesting than the last 5. Say that again, he said. Not a threat. Worse, curiosity. Source's heart was doing something violent against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was steady. Because voices are easier to control than hearts, and she'd had a lifetime of practice controlling the only thing she could. We have grain for 1 sack in 9, not half. I counted it myself 2 nights ago. She looked at Bray, not the king. That was its own kind of defiance, looking at the smaller danger instead of the larger one. You've been keeping the difference. The square didn't breathe. She's a baker's daughter, Bray said too fast, the words tripping over each other. She doesn't have the keeping of the ledgers. I don't need the ledgers. Sorsay held up her hands, flour ground into the creases of her knuckles, a callus on her right thumb shaped like the handle of every bread paddle she'd ever lifted, the one detail of her that nobody else in Riverbend carried in quite that place, in quite that shape. I have these. I weigh what goes into every oven in this village because half of them are too poor to own scales of their own. I know what's in that granary to the handful. Dane Zasara was looking at her now with the particular stillness of a predator that has stopped pretending to be anything else. What's your name? Suwirse. Suwirse what? Just Suwirse. We don't keep second names here. Second names are for men who want something remembered. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of where one might have lived once. Before a crown taught him better. And if I take the headman's word over yours, then you'll collect a tribute built on a lie, and you'll have known it, because I told you to your face and you chose not to hear it. She hadn't meant to say, to your face. It came out sharper than she'd planned, sharper than was safe, and she watched 2 of his guards shift their weight, hands drifting nearer to hilts they didn't draw. Dane lifted one hand. The guard stilled. Bold, he said. For a woman with flour on her hands and nothing in her name, I have less to lose than he does. She tipped her chin at Bray. That makes me braver. It doesn't make me wrong. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the square moved. Then Dane Vasara turned to his second, a broad-shouldered man with a missing left ear, the lobe taken clean off by something that hadn't been a blade, and said, "Open the granary." The numbers, when they came out into the gray daylight, matched hers to the sack. That should have been the end of the scene, the headman exposed, the king satisfied, the tribute collected on accurate terms, and the column of riders gone by sundown, taking their grain and their banners and their unbothered indifference back to wherever kings keep their unbothered indifference when they're not spending it on villages like this one. It wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning, though nobody standing in that square, least of all Sawirsa, with flour drying to paste in the lines of her palms, understood yet what they'd just watched start. Corlath Bray went the color of old tallow. My king, I can explain the discrepancy. You can. Dane's voice hadn't changed pitch at all, and somehow that was worse than if it had. Later, at length, to someone whose patience for explanations is greater than mine, which today, headman, is considerably smaller than usual. He turned from Bray entirely, a dismissal with his whole spine, and looked back at Siorse like she was the only other person who'd been standing in the square the whole time. The tribute stands. Full collection at the figure she gave. A murmur went through the crowd, not relief. Not yet, something more like held breath finally permitted to move. Full collection, Bray said, and for the first time his composure cracked enough to show the fear under it. We'll leave the village with nothing for spring planting. Then the village should have told me that 6 days ago, instead of letting its headman lie on my face for an extra winter of comfortable rings. Dane's gaze flicked, deliberate to Bray's hands. All 7 of them caught the gray light. I find I have very little patience left today. Collect what's owed. We ride within the hour. He was already turning back toward his horse when Sorsey heard herself speak again, and some distant, sensible part of her noted with real alarm that she appeared to have no intention of stopping. Then you'll be taking grain from children too young to have lied to you, to punish a man who's old enough to have known better. Dane stopped. He didn't turn immediately. There was a beat, 1, 2, where his shoulders simply held still, like a held breath made of muscle and old coat wool, and Sorsace watched the back of his neck and thought, with the particular clarity of a woman who has just done something she cannot undo, that's the wrong thing to say to a king in front of his own men. When he turned, his expression hadn't changed. That was somehow more frightening than if it had. "You think the children will go hungry," he said, "because of what I collect. I know they will. I've watched them go hungry for less. And you think that's mine to fix. I think it's yours to kazaz, which means it's yours to answer for." She heard Spray make a small, strangled sound somewhere to her left and ignored it entirely. "You came here to collect what's owed. Fine, collect it from the man who stole it. Don't collect it twice, once from his rings and once from their bellies." The square had gone past silent into something closer to held suspension. 40-some people who had all, individually and at once, decided that breathing audibly in the next several seconds carried genuine personal risk. Dane Vasara studied her for what felt, to Siorsa, like the length of a season. "You'd stand between your king and his due," he said slowly, "for people who didn't ask you to. They didn't have to ask. That's what standing for someone means." Her hands had curled into fists at her sides without her permission, the cut already there on her palm. She hadn't even noticed getting it, some edge of the granary door, sharp wood, blood she'd find later when the adrenaline let go, pressed into her own skin. If the only people you protect are the ones who can pay you for it, you're not a king. You're just the largest wolf in the yard. Somewhere behind her, she heard Bray inhale like a man watching his own execution. Dane's eyes had gone very still, very pale. The color of that pre-snow sky stretched thin over something colder underneath. For one long moment, Cyrusay genuinely believed she had just spoken her last sentence as a free woman, that the next sound in the square would be a guard's boots crossing the cobbles toward her. Instead, he said, almost to himself, "The largest wolf in the yard." And then, louder, to his second, "Take stock of the granary, full inventory. Bray's private stores as well. Every cellar, every strongbox." His eyes hadn't left her face. "We're not riding within the hour." He didn't say why. He didn't explain himself. Not to her, not to the square, not to the headman now sweating through his collar in the cold. He simply turned and walked toward the granary himself, boots loud on the frozen ground, leaving 40 villagers and 1 baker's daughter to stand in a square that had, in the space of perhaps 90 seconds, stopped being the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Sowers looked down at her hand, blood dark and unhurried, tracking along the lifeline of her palm. She hadn't even felt the wood bite. The inventory took 3 hours. Circe spent most of it pretending not to watch the granary doors, scrubbing flour off a work table that had already been scrubbed twice, listening to the village do what villages do when something has cracked open, and nobody yet knows what's underneath. Quiet conversations pitched low, glances toward the headman's house, a few of the older women crossing themselves in the old way, the way from before the pacts, when God still meant something separate from kings. Bray hadn't been arrested. He also hadn't been permitted to leave the square. He stood near the well with 2 of Dane's guards flanking him at a polite, unbreachable distance, his rings catching the thin winter light every time his hands moved. And his hands moved often, restless, a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. It was the second hour when Dane's second, the one-eared man, whose name she'd later learn was Garrow, found her at the work table. "The king wants you." Her stomach did something complicated. "Wants me where?" "Granary." Garrow's remaining ear had a small notch in it, an old fight scar, and he scratched at it absently while he looked her over, not unkindly, more like a man cataloging a fact he hadn't expected to need. He doesn't bite Baker's daughter, not unprovoked. I provoked him fairly thoroughly an hour ago. You did. Something that might have been amusement moved through Garrow's face and vanished. Fast, the way amusement tends to in men who've spent a long time learning not to show it. He's still asking for you. Make of that what you like. She wiped her hands on her apron, futile, they'd been flour and blood since morning, and followed him across the square, aware of every eye that tracked her path, aware of Bray's eyes most of all, sharp and frightened and calculating all at once. The granary smelled the way it always did, dust and old grain and the cold mineral smell of stone that never quite warmed, even in summer. Dane stood at the center of it with a ledger open in his hands. Not Bray's ledger. She realized a different one, leather-bound and new, and 3 of his men were stacking sacks against the far wall, counting under their breath. He looked up when she entered. The granary's single high window threw a long bar of gray light across the floor, and he was standing just outside it, half in shadow, which struck her as deliberate, though she couldn't have said why. You were right, he said. No preamble. To the sack. I told you I would be. You did. He closed the ledger. Do you know what's in his cellar? No. 41 households worth of comfort. Coin he's been skimming off every tribute for 6 years, by my men's count. Wine he had no business affording, furs that don't grow on a headman's salary. He said it without heat, a man reading weather off a horizon, and that flatness was somehow more unsettling than rage would have been. He's been telling Riverbend it was starving while he ate well enough to forget the taste of hunger entirely. Sorsay felt something cold move through her, a confirmation of thing she'd half suspected and never let herself fully believe, because believing it changed nothing she could act on. And now? Now I have a decision to make about my headman. He studied her in that unhurried way again, the way that made her feel less like she was being looked at, and more like she was being read, line by line, the way she read dough for the exact moment it had finished proving. And I find I'm more interested, at the moment, in the woman who caught him. I didn't catch him for your benefit. No, he agreed. You did it for 41 households who never asked you to. I noticed that's part, too. She didn't have an answer for that, which annoyed her more than the silence itself. He let it sit a moment, then turned back toward the window, hands folded behind his back, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter, almost private, the kind of register a man uses when he's thinking aloud and has forgotten, briefly, that someone else is in the room to hear it. Do you know why I collect tribute myself? Instead of sending taxmen, the way every king before me did, to frighten people into paying on time. That's what most assume. A faint, humorless almost smile. It's not fear I'm after. It's truth. Taxmen collect numbers. I collect what the numbers are hiding. He glanced back at her. Most villages give me a headman's smile and a headman's lie, and nobody beneath that headman dares contradict it. Because contradicting your own leader in front of an alpha king tends to end badly for the leader's enemies long after the king's ridden home. Something in her chest went very still. Is that a threat? It's an observation. You should be afraid of what happens to you after I leave, and you don't seem to be, which means either you're a fool. His eyes moved over her, not unkindly, almost curious. Or you're someone who's already decided the worst has already happened to you, and there's nothing left for a headman's spite to take. He'd read her in 4 sentences better than most people in Riverbend had managed in 4 years. My mother died of fever 2 winters back, she said, before she could decide whether she meant to. My father the winter before that, working a debt he never finished paying. I bake other people's bread to eat, in a house that isn't mine, and I have exactly nothing a headman could threaten to take from me that I haven't already lost. She lifted her chin. That's not courage, my king. That's arithmetic. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not pity. She'd have hated pity, and some instinct told her he knew that, and wouldn't have offered it regardless. Something closer to recognition. Arithmetic, he repeated softly. I've heard men twice your age call it courage and mean something far smaller. The granary door opened before she could answer, Garrow's silhouette filling the frame. My king, the headman's asking to speak with you. Says he has information you'll want regarding the village's accounts. Dane's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Of course he does. He looked back at Sayorse one more time before he left, a look she couldn't fully name, and said only, Stay in the village tonight, don't go far. It wasn't a request, exactly. It also wasn't quite a command. She stood alone in the granary a long moment after he'd gone, listening to the wind move through the high window, and pressed her thumb hard into the cut on her palm, like she could press the whole strange afternoon back into something that made sense. It didn't work. Word moved through Riverbend faster than the king's horses had. By the time the sun dropped low and orange behind the hills, everyone in the village knew 3 things. That Bray had been stealing from his own people for years, that the king had not yet decided what to do about it, and that a baker's daughter with flowers, creased hands had been the one to bring the lie down. Nobody quite knew what to do with that third fact. So some treated her like she'd grown a second head. An old woman named Eddie Vane, the only person left alive in Riverbend who remembered the village before the current pack treaty, with a left hand permanently curled from a fire 40 years gone, caught Sayorse's wrist outside the bakehouse and held it with surprising strength. You shouldn't have spoken, Eddie said, not unkindly, urgently. Headmen who get exposed don't forgive the ones who exposed them. Kings ride away. Headmen stay. He was going to take it from the children's mouths, and now Bray will take it from yours, the moment that King's banner is over the hill. Eddie's curled hand tightened. You've made an enemy who lives here, girl, to please a man who doesn't. The word sat in Sayorse's stomach like a stone all through the early evening, through the strange, unfamiliar quiet of a bakehouse with no bread baking, through the sound of unfamiliar men's voices drifting from the direction of the square where Dane's company had made a rough camp rather than ride on. She told herself Eddie was wrong. She wasn't entirely sure she believed it. She was banking the bakehouse's last coals, getting ready to bar the door for the night, when she heard footsteps outside that didn't belong to anyone in Riverbend. Too deliberate, a soldier's gait even at rest. Garrow stood in the doorway when she opened it, his notched ear catching the last orange light. He wants to walk the village, he said. Asked for you to show him. It's nearly dark. He's aware. Something in Garrow's face suggested he found this whole situation mildly entertaining in a way he had no intention of explaining. He doesn't sleep much, the king. Says the dark's when a place tells you the truth it hides in daylight. She should have said no. She thought about saying no, standing there with the bakehouse's last warmth at her back and a stranger's king waiting somewhere in the dusk for an answer. She got her shawl instead. He was waiting near the well, alone, no guards in sight, which struck her as strange enough that she almost said something about it before deciding she'd provoked him enough for one day. The cold had sharpened since sundown. Her breath came out in pale clouds, and his did too, which she found she hadn't expected. Somehow, some childish assumption that a king's breath wouldn't show the same as anyone else's. You didn't have to come, he said. You didn't have to ask a baker to be your guide. You have a second who knows this village better than I do by now, probably, after 3 hours in the granary. I didn't want Garrow's accounting of it. He fell into step beside her as she started walking, an easy, unhurried pace that didn't match the size of him, the leashed weight of him. I wanted yours. They walked the village's single crooked street in near silence for a while, past shuttered windows with thin lines of firelight underneath, past the well, past the chapel that hadn't had a proper roof in 3 years. She found herself narrating without quite deciding to. This house lost its second son to the border levy 2 summers back. That family hadn't eaten meat since autumn. The old smithy had gone cold the same season. Bray started wearing his fourth ring. Dane listened to all of it with a stillness that unsettled her more than questions would have. He didn't interrupt. He didn't perform sympathy. He simply absorbed it, the way stone absorbs cold, holding on to it long after the source has moved on. "You know this village by its wounds," he said eventually. "I know it by what it's lost. That's most of what's left to know. And what would you ask for if I offered to fix one wound and only one?" She stopped walking. "Why would you offer that?" "Because I find myself curious what a woman with nothing left to lose would choose to save, given the choice." His pale eyes caught what little light the evening offered, steady, unreadable. "Most men ask me for gold. You haven't asked me for anything." "I don't want anything from you." It came out sharper than she meant, an old reflex, the kind that had kept her upright through 2 years of losing nearly everyone she'd loved. Wanting things from kings is how villages like this one end up indebted for generations. "I'd rather want nothing and lose nothing than want something and lose it later, when you've ridden home and forgotten my name." Something crossed his face she couldn't name. Not offense, not quite. Closer to being caught at something. "You think I'd forget your name. I think kings forget most things that aren't useful to them. I haven't forgotten a tribute figure or a debt in 9 years of ruling." His voice had dropped again, quieter, the private register from the granary. "I don't expect I'll forget the woman who called me the largest wolf in the yard, in front of 40 witnesses, with blood on her hand and nothing to gain by it." She looked down. She'd forgotten the cut entirely. It had stopped stinging hours ago, gone to a dull, persistent throb under the cold. In the gray near dark, the blood looked black against her skin. "You're still bleeding," he said, and something in his voice changed register entirely. Not the king's flat, unhurried weather, something rougher underneath it, surprised by itself. "It's nothing." Splinter from the granary door. "Let me see it. It's nothing." He'd already reached for her wrist before she finished the sentence, and she let him, which surprised her more than his asking had. His hand closed around her forearm, not tight, careful, the kind of careful that takes more control than gripping hard wood, and she felt the heat of him even through the cold evening air, a warmth that didn't belong to any ordinary man's hand. He turned her palm up toward what little light the moon offered. The cut ran a clean 2 inches across her lifeline, deeper than she'd realized. The edges gone pale with cold. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, very low, "You did this defending grain that wasn't yours, for children who don't know your name, in front of a king who could have had you whipped for the insolence of speaking before being spoken to. I didn't think about any of that while I was doing it." "I know." His thumb moved once, barely, along the uninjured edge of her palm, and stopped, like he'd caught himself crossing a line he hadn't meant to approach. "That's what unsettles me about it." She pulled her hand back. Not hard. Just enough. He let it go without resistance, immediate, like he'd been waiting for permission to release rather than holding on past it. "You should bandage that," he said, and the king's flat weather had returned to his voice, though something underneath it hadn't quite gone back to where it had been. "I will." Good. He didn't move to leave. Neither did she. The village street sat quiet and dark around them, smoke rising thin from a dozen chimneys, somewhere a dog barking once and falling silent. So say. It was the first time he'd used her name since the square. It landed strangely, hearing it in his voice like a word she'd loaned out and gotten back changed. "My king. Dane," he said. "When it's only the two of us, I find I'd like to hear you say it." She didn't say it. Not yet. But she didn't correct him either, and they both seemed to understand that the silence she left in its place meant something neither of them was ready to name aloud, standing in the cold dark of a village that had, until that morning, never once mattered to a king. He left without his guards, posted near the bakehouse that night, which she noticed and chose not to examine too closely. She didn't sleep well. She told herself it was the cold. The next morning broke gray and hard, frost thick enough on the bakehouse window that she had to breathe a clear patch into it just to see the square. What she saw made her stop with the kindling still in her hands. Bray's house had a guard posted at the door. Not Riverbend's usual lazy watch. One of Dane's own men, armed, stationed like the headman himself, had become something requiring containment. She was still staring when Garrow appeared at her door for the second time, in as many days, his expression giving away nothing. He wants you again. He's going to wear out my welcome with my own neighbors, summoning me twice in a day. He's going to wear out considerably more than that before this is done, I expect. Garrow's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. Granary. Now. The granary looked different in daylight, emptied further, sacks stacked and counted and recounted, a row of strong boxes she didn't recognize lined up against the wall, their lids open, coin and small folded papers visible inside. Dane stood over them with the new ledger again, and this time Bray stood beside him, flanked by 2 guards, his composure entirely gone, his rings somehow smaller looking on hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "Tell her," Dane said, without looking up from the ledger, "what you told me an hour ago." Bray's eyes found Sawarsi's and something in them. Not quite hatred, something colder and more practical than hatred, made her skin go tight. "This wasn't only me," Bray said, the words coming fast, ugly, a man bargaining with the only currency he had left. "The tribute figures. I didn't invent the skimming on my own. It's been done this way since before me. Every headman in the valley does the same. Takes a fifth off the top, calls it administration. Calls it the cost of keeping order. He's telling you this," Dane said, voice flat, almost bored. Though Cersei was beginning to understand that the boredom was its own kind of warning. "Because he hopes naming other thieves will make me forget about him." "It won't work either way," Cersei said, before she could stop herself, looking at Bray rather than the king, because some old instinct told her that was still the right place to aim her anger. "You let children go hungry, so you could keep wine in your cellar. That doesn't get smaller because other men did it too." Bray's face crumpled, briefly, into something that might have been the first honest expression she'd seen on it in years. "I have a family, girl. I have daughters. So do half the families in this village, and theirs aren't eating either." Dane closed the ledger with a soft, final sound. "Take him to the wagon. He rides with us when we leave. There'll be a full accounting before the pack council, and a punishment fitting what's owed, which will not be decided by me alone, and will not be decided today." He looked at Bray with something that, for the first time since the square, resembled actual contempt rather than cold procedure. "You'll have time to consider on the road exactly how many winters you cost this village while you slept warm." The guards led Bray out. He didn't look at Cersei again. She found she didn't need him to. When the granary had emptied of everyone but the 2 of them, Dane finally looked up from the empty space where the ledger had been, and something in his expression had shifted from the cold, procedural weight of the morning into something more careful, more deliberate. "There's a second matter," he said. "There's always a second matter with you." The almost smile again, there and gone. The tribute. As corrected, it still leaves Riverbend short for spring planting, even with Bray's hoarded stores returned to the village rather than my own treasury. Which is the order I've given, in case you were wondering whether I intended to simply transfer the theft to myself. I wasn't wondering. I was hoping. I noticed. He studied her again, that reading look, the one that made her feel catalogued rather than seen. "I've decided to forgive a third of this year's tribute outright, and extend the planting season grace on the remainder by 2 full moons. Riverbend will have grain enough and seed enough to come back from this properly, rather than crawling toward the next harvest on debt and rationing." She felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight for so long. She'd half forgotten it was tight at all. "Why?" "Because the village told me the truth once it had the chance to. That's worth rewarding. He paused. And because the woman who made that chance possible put her own hand through a door rather than let children starve to spare a thief's comfort. And I find I'm disinclined to let that cost her anything further. You don't owe me anything for telling the truth. I'm aware I don't owe it. I'm choosing it. Something in his voice had gone lower again, that private register, the one she was beginning to recognize as the sound of him setting the king down for a moment to let something else speak. There's a difference, Sayurse, between what a man's obligated to give and what he wants to. The use of her name, unprompted this time, sat between them like something neither of them had quite decided what to do with. I should get back to the bakehouse, she said, which wasn't an answer to anything he'd actually said, and they both seemed to understand that. You should. He didn't move to stop her. I'll be in the village another day at least, settling the accounts properly. I find I'm not finished here. She left the granary without asking him what, exactly, here meant anymore. The tribute, the village, or something that had started in a town square with blood on her palm and showed no signs, yet, of being finished. The accounting took 4 more days. Sayurse told herself each morning that she had no particular reason to expect to see Dane Vazara before the day's bread was proofed and baked. And each morning, by mid-morning, she somehow had. He had a way of appearing at the bakehouse door that she came to recognize before she even turned around. Not the heaviness of his men's boots. Something lighter, more deliberate, a man, choosing not to announce himself with noise he could easily have made. The second morning, he came with a question about the village's water rights that could easily have gone to anyone else in Riverbend. The third, with no question at all. Just a long silence spent watching her shape loaves with a focus that made her hands clumsier than they'd been in years, an awareness of being watched that she hadn't felt since she was a girl first learning the trade under her mother's eye. You're staring, she said on the third morning, not looking up from the dough. I'm observing. There's a difference. Is there? Staring implies I don't know what I'm looking at. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, the granary ledger nowhere in sight for once. Just him out of the black coat today, sleeves pushed back despite the cold, forearms corded with old scars she didn't ask about, and he didn't explain. I know exactly what I'm looking at. I'm simply choosing to keep looking. Her hands stilled on the dough, despite every intention not to let them. You shouldn't say things like that to a baker's daughter. Why not? Because baker's daughters don't have anywhere to put them. She forced her hands back into motion, folding, turning, the rhythm she could do half asleep suddenly requiring her full attention. You'll ride home in a few days. I'll still be here, needing bread for a village that'll spend the next year whispering about the time I made an enemy of its headmen to please a passing king. Whatever this is, she gestured vaguely between them, flour dusting the air. It doesn't survive that ride home. It can't. So don't say things that make it harder to remember that. He was quiet long enough that she risked a glance up. He wasn't looking at her with the careful, controlled patience of the granary anymore. Something rawer sat behind his eyes, something that looked, briefly, almost like frustration turned inward. You think I don't know the shape of what I'm asking, he said. A king's attention is a dangerous gift to give a woman with no rank to protect her from what it costs her after he's gone. I know that better than you'd credit me for knowing it. He pushed off the doorframe, came 2 steps closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him in the cold bakehouse air, close enough that her whole body went very still and very aware at once. I'm not offering you a fairy story, Sayurse. I'm telling you I haven't been able to stop thinking about a woman who stood in a square with blood on her hand and told her king he wasn't a king at all, if he only protected men who could pay for it. That's not nothing. I don't know yet what it is, but it isn't nothing. Her pulse was loud enough in her own ears that she wondered absurdly if he could hear it, Some half-remembered story about wolf-blooded men and their senses surfacing at the worst possible moment. "I have flour under my nails," she said. Which wasn't an argument, wasn't anything at all, just the only true thing she could find in the moment to hold on to. I noticed. His voice had dropped lower still. "I find I don't mind it." He didn't touch her. That was its own kind of statement, close enough that she could have closed the last 18 inches between them herself, and he simply stood there, hands at his sides, leaving the choice entirely hers to make or not make. The bakehouse fire popped once, loud in the silence. Somewhere outside, a cartwheel creaked over frozen ruts. She stepped back first. Something flickered across his face. Not hurt, not quite. Something closer to a man recalibrating a calculation he'd been confident of and finding it more complicated than expected. "Forgive me," he said, and it cost him something to say it. She could hear that. "I overstepped." "You didn't." It was the truth, and she found she owed him that much. "I just don't know what to do with a king who looks at me like I'm worth looking at." "Then perhaps," he said, already retreating toward the door, putting the careful distance back between them like a man putting his armor back on, "we have that in common. I don't entirely know what to do with it either." He left without another word. She stood alone in the bakehouse a long time after, hands buried in dough gone cold and unworked, and found she missed the warmth of him standing near her more than she was prepared to admit to anyone, least of all herself. The fifth morning, everything changed shape entirely. Seorse woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices in the square. Not the low murmur of villagers, something sharper, more urgent. She was out the bakehouse door with her shawl half-tied before she'd fully processed what she was hearing. Garrow stood near the well, and beside him, looking deeply unhappy to be standing anywhere near a king's second, was a thin, anxious man Source recognized as one of Bray's household servants. A boy, really, barely 17, with a stutter he'd had since childhood, and a missing front tooth from a fall years back. "Tell her what you told me," Garrow said. The boy, his name was Pell, she remembered now. Bray had kept him for years doing the household's worst chores, looked at Sorsa like she might somehow make the next sentence easier to say. The tribute wasn't only about the grain," Pell stammered. "I heard him. The headman. Talking to one of the king's men, 2 nights back before they put him in the wagon. He said," Pell's hands twisted together. "He said the tribute collection was never just about collecting. He said the king's been doing it this way for years. Riding to villages himself, letting the headman lie, watching who corrects them and who doesn't." The ground seemed to shift slightly under Sawersi's feet. "Watching for what? For someone who'll stand up." Pell's voice dropped, like the words themselves were dangerous to hold. He said the tribute's a test. The king doesn't care half so much about the grain as he cares about who in a village is brave enough, or fool enough, to tell him the truth when it costs them something to tell it. Headmen who pass it get left alone. Headmen who fail it. He gestured helplessly toward the wagon, toward the absence where Bray had been. Sowers felt something cold and clarifying move through her chest, displacing 6 days of careful, cautious feeling with something far less comfortable. "He's been doing this for years," she said slowly, riding into villages, letting headmen lie to him, waiting to see who corrects them. That's what the headman said. Pell looked miserable, caught between 2 dangerous truths he hadn't asked to be the one to deliver. He said no one's ever passed it before, not properly. "A few brave fools have spoken up over the years," he said, "but never anyone with the facts to back the accusation. The king always lets the lie stand if no one can prove it's a lie. You're the first one who ever had the numbers to make it stick. The bakehouse, the granary. 6 days of stolen mornings and careful conversations, and a hand that hadn't touched her but had wanted to. All of it rearranged itself in her mind into a different shape entirely, and the new shape made something in her chest go hard and cold and furious all at once. She'd thought she'd stumbled into something. She'd thought the truth she'd told had been hers alone, unplanned, born purely of an empty granary and a lie she couldn't stomach. Instead, she'd been standing, the entire time, inside a test designed by a king who'd watched dozens of villages fail it before her, who'd let children go hungry in other places to see which leaders would lie and which would not, who had, and this was the part that made her hands curl into fists at her sides, known, from the very first moment in the square, exactly what kind of test he was running on her, and said nothing. She found Dane in the granary an hour later, where Garrow had told her he'd be, going over the final tribute ledger with the calm, unhurried focus of a man entirely unaware that the ground he stood on had just shifted. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he saw on her face made his own expression change immediately, the careful warmth of the past few days replaced by something more guarded. "So we're say, is it true?" Her voice came out flatter than she'd intended. All the careful softness of the past days burned away. "The tribute. It's a test. You let headmen lie, every village, every year, and you watch to see who in the crowd has the courage to call it." His jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. That, more than anything, told her everything. "Yes," he said, "and you've done this before. Other villages, other headmen, every tribute ride, for 9 years. And no one's ever passed, no one's ever had what you had." His voice had gone low, careful, a man choosing each word with the precision of someone diffusing something live. The conviction, and the facts. Most who speak up do so on instinct alone, and a headman with a smooth enough lie can still talk his way past instinct. "You had numbers. You'd counted the granary yourself, 2 nights before I arrived, for no reason except that you couldn't stand not knowing." Something in his expression shifted, softened, despite the tension still coiled through the rest of him. "You didn't pass a test, Sawersa. You're simply the first person in 9 years who was already living like the test mattered, long before I ever rode into the square. That doesn't change that you let it happen." Her voice cracked slightly, the anger underneath finally cresting. "How many villages, Dane? How many granaries did you let stay empty while you watched, and waited to see if anyone would speak? How many children went hungry in some other river bend because their headman was a better liar than Bray, and nobody had the facts to call it?" He didn't flinch from the question. That, at least, she'd give him. "More than I'm proud of," he said quietly. "Every one of them sits with me. The system isn't kind, and I've known that since the year I started it. But the alternative was worse, sending taxmen who collect numbers, and never the truth behind them, never knowing which headmen were honest and which were thieves wearing a headman's coat, ruling 4 packs worth of villages blind. This way, I learned the truth eventually. It's costly. It's not painless. It is, God help me, the best method I've found in 9 years of trying to find a better one. That's not an answer. That's an excuse with better posture." Something flickered across his face. Not anger, something closer to being genuinely struck. "You're right," he said, after a moment, and the admission seemed to cost him. "It is an excuse. A necessary one, I've told myself for 9 years. But you're right that necessary and right aren't the same word, and I let myself forget the difference more often than I should have." The granary sat quiet around them, dust motes turning slow in the bar of gray light from the high window. "Was I real to you?" Cyrus asked, and hated how much the question cost her to ask. "Or was I only ever the first person to finally pass your test?" "Both." He said it without hesitation, which surprised her more than a careful answer would have. "You passed the test in the square, in the first 90 seconds, before I knew anything else about you. Everything since, the walk through the village, the bakehouse, the things I said to you that I had no right saying to a woman I'd known 4 days. None of that was the test. The test ended the moment Bray's granary opened, and your count matched mine to the sack. Everything after that was simply me wanting to know you, the way a man wants to know a woman who unsettled something in him he thought had gone permanently quiet. That's a very convenient thing to say, now that I've found out the test existed at all. It's also true. His eyes held hers, steady, unflinching. I won't ask you to simply believe me. I understand why you wouldn't right now. But I won't lie to you a second time by pretending the timing doesn't look exactly as bad as it is. She turned away from him, needing the distance, needing a moment where his pale, steady eyes weren't reading every flicker of her face like a ledger he intended to balance. I need to think, she said. Take whatever time you need. He didn't move to stop her, didn't reach for her, though she felt the want of it radiating off him even from across the granary. I'm not leaving Riverbend until the accounts are settled properly. That's at least 2 more days. I'll be here. Whenever you're ready to speak again. If you're ever ready. She left without answering, and didn't look back to see his face, and told herself the tightness in her own chest was anger, and nothing more complicated than that. It took her until nightfall to admit it was more complicated than that. She found Eddie Vane at her hearth, curled hand wrapped around a cup of something bitter and herbal, and sat across from her without quite meaning to ask the question she ended up asking. If a king tested a whole village and found it wanting for 9 years running, Sarsi said, what kind of king does that make him? Cruel or just thorough? Eddie considered the question with the particular patience of someone who'd outlived 3 headmen and 2 kings before this one's. Depends, she said finally, on what he does once he's found what he was looking for. A cruel man runs the test forever and never changes anything for what he learns. A thorough man runs it because every other method failed worse and stops the moment he's found someone worth listening to. She took a slow sip from her cup. Which one is yours, girl? He's not mine. Eddie's eyes, sharp despite her age, didn't quite hide their amusement. You came here at dusk with your hands shaking to ask an old woman philosophy about a king you say isn't yours. Forgive me if I find that a touch unconvincing. Circe didn't have an answer for that either, and Eddie, with the wisdom of a woman who'd learned exactly when silence served better than counsel, didn't push for one. She thought about it long into the night instead, alone in the small cold room above the bakehouse, turning the granary conversation over and over until the edges of her anger had worn down enough to see what sat underneath it. He'd lied by omission. That was true, and it mattered. And she wasn't ready to pretend it didn't. But he'd also knelt in mud he didn't have to kneel in, and asked her name when he could have simply demanded it, and stood close enough in the bakehouse doorway to cross a line and chosen, deliberately, not to cross it without her consent. He'd given the village back its stolen grain rather than keep it for his own treasury. He'd called himself to her face, a man running a flawed system out of necessity rather than virtue, when a lesser man would have dressed the cruelty up as kindness and let her believe it. Flawed, not false. She wasn't yet sure those were the same thing, however much her pride wanted them to be. She fell asleep without resolving it, and woke the next morning still unresolved, and might have stayed that way for the better part of another day if the village square hadn't erupted, just past mid-morning, into the kind of commotion that made unresolved feelings briefly, urgently irrelevant. The shouting reached the bakehouse before Circe did, raw and furious, more voices than she could immediately sort, and underneath it all, unmistakable, Corlith Bray's voice, pitched high with something that sounded less like fear now, and more like desperation, cornered into recklessness. She came around the corner into the square to find Bray free of the wagon, somehow, a knife in his hand that he had absolutely no business holding, and Pell, the stuttering servant boy, the one who'd told her the truth about the test, held in front of him, with the blade pressed close enough to draw a thin red line along his throat. Nobody comes closer, Bray was shouting, his composure entirely gone now, sweat standing out on his forehead despite the cold. Nobody. I want a horse and a head start, or the boy bleeds for telling tales he had no business telling. Dane stood perhaps 15 feet away, very still, hands open and visible at his sides, the king's flat, unhurried weather entirely absent from his face, replaced by something colder and far more focused. Garrow and 2 other guards held position behind him, weapons drawn but not raised, waiting on a word he hadn't yet given. "Let the boy go," Dane said, voice level, "and we discuss terms. Harm him, and there are no terms left to discuss, Bray. Only consequences. You'll kill me regardless. I heard the talk. Pack council. A fitting punishment. You said it yourself." Bray's knife hand trembled, the blade nicking skin, a thin bright line of red appearing on Pell's throat that made the boy go rigid with terror. "I have nothing left to lose by taking one more thing from this village before I go." Sars felt her whole body go cold and very, very still. She knew Pell. She'd known him since he was a boy stealing scraps from the bakehouse window, too proud to beg and too hungry not to take. She'd watched him grow into the stammering, anxious young man, currently standing with a blade at his throat because he'd told her the truth she'd needed to hear. She moved before she'd consciously decided to, stepping past Garrow's outstretched arm into the open space between Dane and Bray, close enough now that she could see the wild animal panic in the headman's eyes. "Soersi." Dane's voice, sharp with an alarm she'd never heard in it before, cut off as she lifted both hands, empty, showing them to Bray the way you'd show an animal you meant no harm. "You don't want him," she said to Bray, steady despite the hammering of her own heart. "You want a way out. He's not your way out. A dead servant boy gets you a king's full fury and nothing else. Take me instead." "Soir, no." Dane's voice again, rawer now, and she heard him take a step forward that Garrow's arm this time physically blocked. "I'm the one who exposed you," Sarsi said, still looking only at Bray, holding his wild eyes with her own. "I'm the one who counted your granary and called your lie in front of the whole square. If you want a hostage who actually matters to this king, you're holding the wrong throat." Bray's eyes flicked between her and Pell, calculation warring with panic, and for 3 agonizing seconds, Soersi genuinely didn't know which way it would break. Then his grip on Pell loosened, just slightly, and Soersi closed the remaining distance fast. Too fast for caution. Fast enough that Dane shouted something behind her that she didn't fully hear, and got one hand on Pell's shoulder and shoved him hard toward the watching guards. Bray's knife, off balance now, swept sideways. It caught her along the forearm, a line of white-hot pain that took her breath entirely, deep enough that she felt it in her teeth, and she heard herself make a sound she'd never made before, somewhere between a gasp and a cry, as Garrow's blade came down and Bray's knife clattered to the cobblestones, and the headman went down hard under 3 of the king's guards at once, shouting something that no longer sounded like demands, only fear. Soersi didn't see the rest of it. The world had narrowed, abruptly, to the white-hot line along her arm, and the cobblestones rushing up faster than she expected. And then Dane was there, somehow already there, catching her before she fully hit the ground, his arms around her with a strength that felt less like rescue and more like something close to desperation. "I have you," he said, voice cracking in a way she'd never heard from him, the king entirely absent from it, only the man underneath. "Soersi, I have you." That part, the part where the king knelt in the mud of an unremarkable village square, holding her wrist with both hands like it was the only thing in the world made of glass, was where this story actually began, 6 days and 1 lifetime ago, before any of them understood what they were standing inside. She came back to herself slowly, the square swimming into focus by degrees. Dane's face above hers, pale with something that wasn't the careful, unhurried weather of a king at all. His hands working fast, and sure to bind the wound with a strip of cloth someone had torn from a cloak, pressing hard enough to slow the bleeding, his jaw tight with a fury he was visibly working to keep leashed. "You absolute fool," he said, low, raw, the words coming out more like a prayer than an insult. "You walked toward a knife. It wasn't going to take Pell." Her voice came out thinner than she wanted. the pain finally registering in full, sharp and insistent along her arm. I did the arithmetic. Don't! His hands stilled on the binding for a moment. Just a moment, like he needed it to steady himself before continuing. Don't make this a joke. Not yet. Not while I can still feel my own heart trying to climb out of my chest. Around them, the square had gone into the controlled chaos of aftermath. Bray dragged off in restraints far heavier than before, Pell sobbing with relief in Eddie Vane's good arm. Villagers spilling out of doorways to see what the commotion had been. None of it fully reached Sayurse. The world had narrowed to Dane's hands, careful and fast and shaking very slightly, despite their precision, and his face. Stripped of every careful king's distance she'd watched him maintain for 6 days. "You should be furious with me," she said. "I disobeyed every order you didn't give, and put myself between a desperate man and his only leverage. I am furious with you." His eyes lifted to hers, and the fury was there, plainly, alongside something else entirely, something that looked, in that unguarded moment, dangerously close to terror. "I am also." He stopped, swallowed, twice. "I have ruled 4 packs for 9 years, Sayurse. I have stood in rooms where men twice your size meant to kill me, and felt less than I felt in the 3 seconds it took that knife to find your arm." She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't certain there was one to give. He finished the binding, fast and competent, the kind of field dressing that spoke of a man who'd done this before, on himself or others, more times than he likely wanted to count. Then he simply held her hand a moment longer than the dressing required, his thumb resting against her pulse, like he needed the proof of it under his own skin. "I should have told you about the test," he said quietly. "Before any of this. Before I let myself want anything from you that wasn't earned in plain honesty. I told myself the timing didn't matter, because what grew between us was real regardless. I understand now that the lie of omission doesn't get to claim that defense. Not from someone who's already lost as much as you have to, people who weren't honest with her." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. Then let me say it plainly, here, with your blood still on my hands and no test left standing between us to confuse the matter." His grip on her hand tightened, just slightly. "I'm not offering you a king's favor. Sayurse, I'm not offering you a reward for passing some trial you never agreed to take. I'm asking you, as the man underneath the crown, whether there's anything left in you willing to consider a future that includes me in it, once you've had time enough to decide if you can forgive the dishonesty that got us here." She looked at him, really looked, past the crown he wasn't wearing, and the title he hadn't once used to compel her, and found, somewhere underneath 6 days of anger and ache and unresolved fury, that the answer was already sitting closer to the surface than she'd expected. "Ask me again," she said, "when my arms stopped bleeding and I've had a full night to be angry at you, without you watching my face while I do it." Something in him eased, fractionally, relief moving through his shoulders like a held breath finally let go. "That," he said, "I can wait for." He carried her to the healer's house himself, refusing every offer from his own men to take the burden, and Sayurse, dizzy with pain, and the strange, unfamiliar comfort of being held like something precious by a man who'd just watched her bleed because of his own unfinished honesty, found she didn't have it in her to argue about that particular point. The wound healed clean, though it left a scar, a thin, pale line along her forearm that she'd carry the rest of her life. A permanent record of the day she'd stepped between a desperate man and a frightened boy, and very nearly paid more than she meant to. It took her 3 days to be ready to give Dane his answer. Not 3 days of silence. He stayed in Riverbend the entire time, the tribute accounts long since settled, the official business that had brought him there finished and filed away, and still he didn't ride home. He found small, deliberate reasons to remain near her instead, sitting with her through the worst of the wound's first fever, bringing her tea from Eddie's hearth with his own hands, sitting in companionable silence in the bakehouse doorway, while she relearned, slowly, how to knead dough with an arm still healing. He didn't push. That, more than anything, was what finally tipped the scale in him. Not grand gestures, not a king's persuasive weight, just the patient, steady presence of a man willing to wait out whatever time she needed without once making her feel guilty for needing it. On the third evening, with her arm finally strong enough to hold a cup without trembling, she found him in the square at dusk, alone, looking out over a village he'd arrived in as a stranger collecting debts, and was leaving, days later, as something else entirely. "I've thought about the test," she said, coming to stand beside him. "About the omission. About what it means that I was, for the first 90 seconds, only a contestant in something I never agreed to enter. I know." His jaw was tight, bracing for whatever came next. "I've also thought about everything after those 90 seconds. She turned to face him fully. The granary, the walk through the village, the bakehouse doorway, when you stepped back and let the choice be mine. The way you knelt in the mud without being asked to, and held my wrist like it mattered more than your own dignity did, in front of every guard you have." She took a breath. "A flawed system built out of necessity isn't the same as a man without honor, Dane. You told me the difference yourself. The day you said necessary and right weren't the same word. I think I needed 3 days to believe you actually understood that, rather than simply saying it to win an argument. And now? Now I think the man who ran 9 years of tests and never found anyone worth changing the system for, until he found someone he was willing to fall short of his own caution for. I think that's not the same as a man who'd let me go on believing a comfortable lie forever." She held his eyes. "You corrected yourself. That matters more to me than the mistake." Something moved across his face, slow like a held breath finally permitted to leave a body that had been bracing for the opposite answer. "So we're say, I haven't finished." A faint, unwilling smile pulled at her mouth despite the seriousness of the moment. "If I say yes to whatever you're about to ask, it doesn't happen because you're a king and I'm a baker's daughter who ought to be flattered by the attention. It happens because I choose it, the same way I chose to speak in that square 6 days ago, knowing exactly what it might cost me. I won't be claimed, Dane. Not by a bond, not by gratitude, not by the fact that you knelt in the mud once and meant it. If this happens, it happens because 2 people chose each other plainly, with nothing compelling it but the choosing itself. That," he said, voice rough, "is the only way I'd want it to happen." He reached for her hand then, not the wrist, not the wound, her hand, whole and unhurt. Fingers lacing through hers with a care that felt less like a king's grand gesture and more like a man finally permitting himself something he'd wanted for days and denied himself out of respect for her need to arrive there on her own time. "I have one more thing to ask you," he said, "before you answer anything else. What? Riverbend's new headman position sits vacant, as of 3 days ago, for reasons you're well acquainted with." A faint, real smile. The first she'd seen from him that held no careful king's distance in it at all. "The Pack Council will want someone trustworthy in the role. Someone who counts a granary to the sack, out of principle rather than duty. Someone the village already trusts more than it ever trusted the man it's replacing." Her breath caught. "You're offering me Bray's position. I'm offering you the choice of it. You'd answer to no one's lie again. Yours would be the ledger this village trusts. Yours would be the voice that decides how its tribute gets counted. Yours would be whatever future you choose to build for 41 households who already owe you more than they know how to repay." His thumb moved once across her knuckles. "It's not a crown, Sayorse, but it's everything within my power to give a woman who never asked me for a single thing, and I find I'd like to give it to you, regardless of whatever else you decide about the rest of this." She looked at him a long moment, at the man who'd ridden into her village to collect a debt and was standing in front of her now, days later, offering her something far larger than any debt could measure, asking for nothing in return except the chance to be chosen freely, without rank or bond or crown compelling it. Yes, she said, to the position, and she let the pause sit a moment, watching something anxious flicker behind his pale, steady eyes, before she let him off the hook entirely. And to the rest of it, too. Whatever shape that takes. I find I'd like to know the man underneath the crown a great deal better than these 6 days have allowed. The smile that broke across his face then held nothing careful in it at all. Unguarded, almost boyish. A king's composure entirely abandoned in favor of something far more honest. He didn't kiss her, not yet. That was its own kind of restraint. A final visible step in a chemistry that had earned every inch of ground it covered. And they both seemed to understand, without needing to say it, that the moment deserved to be savored rather than rushed. He simply drew her hand to his chest instead, pressed it flat over his own heartbeat, fast and unsteady in a way no king's careful weather should ever have been, and let her feel exactly how much the asking had cost him to risk. Then let the pack council hear it from my own mouth, he said, before I ride home. Riverbend keeps its new headman, its full granary, and its tribute forgiven a third over. And the Alpha King rides home, having given away considerably more than he came to collect. Word of it moved through the village before the week was out, and through the valley before the season turned. And eventually, as these things do, into the kind of story told over hearths on cold nights, embellished a little more with each telling, until the particulars blurred and only the shape of it remained. A king who rode in to collect tribute, and a woman with flour under her nails who stood up to him in a town square, and a crown that ended up, against every law of how such stories were supposed to go, resting closer to her keeping than his. Sorsay kept the bakehouse a while longer, even after the headman's seat was officially hers, because some things a person earns are worth holding on to a little past the point of necessity, just to remember the hands that built them. The scar on her forearm, faded slow and pale, a thin white line she'd trace sometimes, without meaning to, in quiet moments, the way you trace the edge of something that changed you, and never fully ask why. Dane returned to Riverbend more often than any Alpha King in living memory had ever returned anywhere without a tribute to justify it. Nobody in the Pack Council ever quite worked out how to phrase that in the official record, and in the end, nobody tried very hard. He never knelt in the mud for her again. He didn't need to. By then, she'd already chosen him standing on her own 2 feet, which, in the end, was the only kind of choosing either of them had ever wanted to keep.